Hello, friends. Today we are going to discuss the cultivation theory, which is about the cultivation of attitudes resulting from watching television. We have with us Mr. Orko Chattopadhyay. Welcome to our show, sir.
Hello. Hello.
And I, Adiba Kadir, am a student of Masters in Media Science from ILEAD. Let's find out more on the theory.
Well, the cultivation theory was formulated by Mr. George Gerbner and Mr. Larry Gross in the year 1976. Well, before we delve into the theory, let us first understand that we human beings have something called an imagination.
Right.
So, we imagine things at all times. For example, when we are reading a book, we are actually imagining what we are reading, and the pictures that are created in our mind is what we are actually relishing when we are reading the book, right? So, that power of imagination has been tapped by an extremely dominant source that we call the television. Okay, so the cultivation theory is about the cultivation of attitudes. For example, the cultivation of the attitude of fear, the cultivation of the attitude of love, perhaps, which is a result of watching television. Now, that is what the standpoint of this theory is. Now, this theory was propounded on the basis of an experiment that was conducted on the American people during the 1970s. Television was then a new thing in the homes of the American people. The American culture was just being molded by the programs that were there on the TV. People used to dress like the TV stars. People used to keep hairstyles like the TV stars. So they were influenced. So this influence drew the interest of the government. The National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence initiated a cultural indicators project.
Okay.
Since the American culture was being molded by television, so there must be a study, there must be a research that has to be conducted to understand as to what is the magnitude of the effect on the audience.
Right.
So, Mr. Gerbner, he initiated an experiment in which he conducted a survey in the homes of the American people, and he got a database which he divided into heavy viewers and light viewers. As the term suggests, heavy viewers are those who watch a lot of television, and light viewers are people who spend a comparatively lesser amount of time watching TV. Now, on a lighter note, the TV is also known as the idiot box, right?
Yes, very true.
And that is because the television is giving us audio as well as visual. Audio, visual, content together. So, the audience does not have to imagine what is being shown because he is already seeing it. So, he does not have to imagine.
Right.
Like he has to imagine when he reads a book or when he listens to a radio program, which are more personal mediums, because it makes the individuals do something. The TV does not need you to do something but just stay awake.
Right.
And actually pay a little attention to
So
it.
there is no scope for imagination, nothing of the
So what happens is, since we are hooked or rather glued to a television set, it affects the subconscious mind of the individuals. And the imagination that does not happen when we are watching the TV happens later on in our lives. For example, when a person has watched a horror movie or a horror program on TV, say a dark alley with some eerie music going with it, so there is this feeling of a fear. Okay, so after such a horror program has been showcased to him, that person, after he has watched the program, will start imagining horrific things.
Quite.
If there is a small noise in the next room, he will feel a little bit, his heartbeat will go up, right? And that is a result, direct result of him having watched a horror TV program. That initiated that reaction and that initiated that imagination in the mind of that individual who has thus been influenced by the television. This is the psychological cause for the influence. And Mr. Gerbner was tasked with the purpose of evaluating the magnitude of this influence. So, firstly, he divided the heavy viewers and the light viewers. Then, he initiated this process of asking relevant questions. Okay. So, based on the answers to his questions, he realized that the influence is massive. The amount of imaginations that are post watching TV are growing day by day. People are looking at the world in a different kind of a way, in a way that the world actually is not. There is so much of violence on television, okay, that has been showcased. Earlier, it was not as restricted. Content was more easily allowed to be broadcast.
Right.
So, little children used to watch a lot of violence on TV. And that used to affect their complete psychology, because that is when they are growing up. They are growing up with a perception of the world around them. So if a child is subjected to violence on TV, for him it is just like a child. That child is just like one who is growing up in a war situation in real life. So there is a serious on his psychological and emotional growth altogether. So according to Mr. Gerbner, he thought that the amount of violence that is being shown is constant, but the influence that same violence has is different for different individuals. So that is because of the different personality traits of different individuals. So this difference was also taken into account when the experiment was conducted. Okay? When the experiment was conducted, there were certain assumptions that Mr. Gerbner kept in his mind, and then he initiated the experiment.
So, sir, what were the assumptions about?
Well, we all know what are assumptions. It is something that we have assumed, right? Something that we think is constant. In this experiment, we will not change around these parameters. These are fixed. And then we conduct the experiment. So that is exactly what is an assumption, right? Exactly. So the assumptions that Mr. Gerbner has taken into account when he conducted the experiment, they are firstly that television is a unique medium. It is not like the other mass mediums. That is the first assumption. Television is unique because it is an audio-visual medium. You are not just perceiving it with your eyes, you are perceiving it with your ears as well. And the cognition is of these dual perceptions. Okay? So the effect it has on the mind is double if you compare it with the radio. Because in the radio you are only perceiving the sound. And then the cognition is happening in your mind of the sound. And then you're imagining what you have heard. Right? But television has more impact than the radio. Well, you can then ask me that why not cinema? Cinema also has audio-visual. But then you see, as an impactor, the television is there every day in our lives. Right? It is there inside our home. It has invaded our home. To watch a movie, during that time, to watch a movie, you had to go to a theater. And then you would get to watch one. But you come back home and again you put on the television on after some time, right? So TV is just like a member of the family. So it is so accessible that it has got a higher impact on the daily lives of the individuals. So television shapes the way an individual thinks. That is also something that has been assumed by Mr. Gerbner when he conducted the experiment, because he was conducting the effect of television viewing. So he knew that television viewing has an effect. He was just evaluating or experimenting the magnitude of that effect. So that was another assumption. And one other assumption is there, television viewing and its effect is limited. Meaning, I'll give you an example. When you have watched a horror show, you are a little bit in fear of something happening and you're expecting something to jump out of behind the curtain, perhaps. But for how long does it last? Then you go on to watch a comedy show and you forget that
Right.
kind of, you lose that, you get back your composure after some time. So the effects are not very long lasting, but the effect is comprehensive. Okay? That is something that was also assumed when Mr. Gerbner set off on his experiment. Now let us go into how the research was conducted. What was measured? Okay? Now, the first thing that was measured was the institutional process. The institutional process analysis is the analysis of the institution that is giving out the content, meaning the TV channel. First, he evaluated what was being shown on TV. What do TV channels think will be popular among the people? What the TV channels think would sell? So when the institutional aspect, his analysis was conducted, Mr. Gerbner realized that it is violence primarily that actually sells. People want to watch violence. And so the TV channels are giving out violent programs one after the other, one after the other. So it was acting as if it is a violent world and people were constantly bombarded with violent acts. Even news channels today, they are constantly showcasing violence that is happening.
Right.
And people actually are hooked on to that. They don't change the television channel when they're seeing some violence happening somewhere.
Right.
Just because they like it, the TV channels are bent upon showcasing what the people like and they are thus giving out violence. Also, sex and vulgar kinds of programs are showcased. Objectification of women. Now, these are initiatives by the institution, that is the TV channels themselves. So the first step of Mr. Gerbner's experiment was analysis of the institution and their policy and their content. Okay? Now, in the process of the experiment, the second analysis, the second step was the message system analysis. Meaning, he conducted a research of who are the people at home. Who are the people at home? Some people, like I said, are light viewers because they are working somewhere. They get access to TV in the evening sometime, in the morning sometime. The rest of the day they are not getting access to, or they are not watching. So they are light viewers and the violent content is not being able to bombard these individuals as much.
Right.
But for the heavy viewers, like the older people who are at home, they are being constantly bombarded. So that is the second step and the second analysis that was conducted by Mr. Gerbner. And the third and final analysis and the most important part of his research was the cultivation analysis. Now, the cultivation analysis was a research into what attitude was cultivated in the mind of the audience after watching the TV. So, the heavy viewers, they were heavily influenced. They started believing in a mean world. They started believing that they're living in a world that is full of fear and there is always a gunman lurking just behind and he's always jumpy. That person has been influenced. He's living in a world that actually does not exist. So, that cultivation of fear, that cultivation of the attitude of love, that cultivation of the attitude of insecurity was evident at the end of the experiment. Mr. Gerbner realized that people are perceiving or rather imagining something that actually does not exist. Okay? Now, What were these perceptions? What were these imaginations? When asked, the audience made it evident that the police were viewed in a certain kind of a way. There is so much of violence shown on television, there is so much of activity that the police are showcased doing, that there is a certain public perception of the policemen that were developed. This was a result of the experiment that was conducted. Mr. Gerbner realized that the audience, after having heavily viewed and heavily been influenced by television, have developed this imaginary perception of the police force. That was the first result of the experiment. The second result was Mr. Gerbner realized that the audience have developed a general mistrust. Nobody believes somebody else as he would have believed anymore, because he is constantly seeing things on TV where people are being very deceitful, people are evil. So he would think that most people around him are evil. They are not his friends at all. They do not want any good to come to that individual.
So
and
they cannot even trust their closed ones
yes,
at times.
Yes. So a bridge in relationships had occurred due to television viewing. You see, in the present day, the serials on TV, they have constant twists coming up. At every corner there is a twist. There are a lot of family dramas that are also showcased. So what happens is, in a real life family, they also start suspecting each other. Larger the family, larger the scope for that.
Exactly.
And actually, the influence is most upon those who are staying at home and watching the programs for a long. So, for example, say an older lady in a family has watched a family drama on TV where the daughter-in-law poisons the older woman. So maybe she would feel a little insecure in her own home.
That her own daughter-in-law
might do that. Her, okay, so there is this bridge that has thus been created by television. So that was a result that was also showcased in the experiment that was conducted. Okay. The third result of the experiment was that Mr. Gerbner realized that the people in this world now imagine their world as a mean world, full of villainous, evil people, and expecting a crime to happen just any time now. Okay, so this insecurity, this is a major influence on the personality traits of society as a whole, not just an individual. Television has invaded the homes of the masses, not of a few individuals. And this number of people who are having access to TV is constantly growing. And thus the effect of the influence is also constantly growing.
Right.
And will continue to grow. And with more TV channels, there will be more bombardment of content on the audience. So yes, the negative possibilities, in fact, are limitless.
So that means it has become a syndrome for us.
It is there is a mean world syndrome, like a disease,
right?
Like a disease.
Like a make-believe, because the world does not exist, but we are thinking that it exists.
Such a world does not. The world could be a beautiful place, perhaps, where people are not actually so mean, but they are perceiving or imagining a mean world, and thus they themselves are being mean.
Exactly.
To be a part of that mean world, you yourself are saying, okay, so I'll also be mean. So that is the magnitude of the influence of television viewing. And thus, Mr. Gerbner conducted this research back in 1970, but it is still very relevant. Now, I'll come to that once. Before that, I would also like to say that he also took into account something called a cultivation differential, meaning he linked the amount, or rather the magnitude, of the influence of television viewing to the number of hours, or rather the amount of time that is spent watching television altogether. Meaning, A person who is watching television for 10 hours a day will have 10 units, or that should be the magnitude, the 10 times the amount of influence on his personality than a person who is watching television for 1 hour. Because that person who is watching for 1 hour will only have one time influence.
So that means the time period is
Time period is
measuring the magnitude.
yes. So that is the cultivation, the differential. That is the cultivation differential between the individuals who are all television viewers, some heavy, some light. But the differential is in terms of the outcome is in terms of the influence that has dawned upon the individual because of watching. Also, another term such as mainstreaming means you follow the crowd, right? So if everyone is mean, I will also mainstream and be mean. So these are things that have resulted out of television.
So it's like following the herd.
It's like following the herd. If everyone is wearing a certain kind of fashionable wear, then you think that is what is in fashion right now, and I should follow suit. And he also used the term resonance, meaning we all must be on the same page. Otherwise, we will be the odd one out. Right? So people will resonate with the mass people of society. Otherwise, they will be singled out as unsocial, because society is social, right? So if society is in a certain way, individual will resonate into society and thus be social.
Right.
So now that we know what is the cultivation theory, we come to the present day world now. This was an experiment that was conducted back in 1976. But now there are so many other mediums or media that have come into our homes, just like television once did, like the internet. The internet has just exploded into our lives.
Exactly.
In the form of smartphones. We are not even restricted to our homes to be influenced by the internet. We carry it around in our phones. And we can watch films, we can watch television, we can watch shows that are also shown on television on our phones itself. So the magnitude, or rather the cultivation differential, can now be it is vast now. It can be infinite.
And
we are being
more applied to the internet than to the television.
Yeah, it can be in the present day more applicable to the internet and also to movies, because with the advent of multiplexes, people are watching films at a much more greater frequency than they used to back in the 70s. Okay, for back in the 70s, making a film was itself a very tedious process. With the advent of technology now, that has also brought it down. So now that we know that the cultivation theory is here, and it is growing and growing, and it is infinite, we must conclude on this note that the influence begins since we are born. We are influenced from the moment we are born. We are influenced by our parents, and they watch TV. So that influence comes down to us as well. So thank you for inviting me for this lecture. I hope that I have been able to impart the knowledge of the cultivation theory.
Yes, you have.
Thank you.